You are listening to a brand new episode of Case Closed Review. I'm your host, Professor C, and as usual, we have a lot to discuss. I want to start off this particular first episode of this new show by saying this show is a complete review of the English dub of Case Closed. So, from the Funimation count, that would be episode 1 to 130. So, each episode, we are actually going to explain 5 episodes in the span of one episode on this show. So, for example, episode 1 here will be episodes 1 through 5, then episode 2 will be 6 through 10, and so on and so forth until we get to the very end. I want to start off also by really, in this first episode, so many characters are introduced that are still very important in today's story arc. So I want to go ahead and start off by introducing those characters. Obviously, the show is built around the story of Konan Edogawa, aka Jimmy Kudo. So obviously, the first notable character we see is Jimmy Kudo. And after that, the next character we come across that is still very, very relevant in the story today is Inspector McGuire, who is with him aiding Jimmy in solving this case at the very beginning of the episode. From there, you see Rachel, who is... they are, honestly, in the episode, they are portrayed as love interests. In the series today, they are definitely... The relationship is more developed, I think, than episode 1 leads you to believe. Honestly, in episode 1, when you watch it, they are more... portrayed as they're just starting to maybe date. There's not as much history in there with them that you see in the first episode, but you see that there is a definite interest between them in the episode as you proceed to watch. So Rachel is a very prominent figure even in today's story arc, along with Detective Richard Moore, who is her father. He is introduced as the bumbling idiot, the guy who hasn't solved a case since VHS was cool, and that is a direct quote, by the way, from Jimmy Kudo. Just somebody that's very down on his luck, just can't catch a break, and at times just not the smartest guy in the world, doesn't really think things through, unless it's a real serious situation where he is super focused. Just doesn't normally think things through all the way, and it really leads to problems for him, in the show and just in his life in general. The next characters we kind of prominently see are obviously Gin and Vodka. Gin and Vodka are the two people responsible for shrinking Jimmy Kudo and him becoming Konan Edogawa. The name he had to make up to Rachel so that she wouldn't figure out that he was, really Jimmy. So Gin and Vodka, again, 2 more characters in today's story arc. Very, very relevant. So it's very important that we talk about all these main characters that come into the story. Along with the Junior Detective League. You have Mitch, George, Amy. Again, characters that are still, just from episode 1, that are staples of the franchise and that we still see to this day. They partner up with Conan now, obviously, and help him solve crimes. Sometimes, at least 90% of the time, it seems to me, and just an opinion, that they're in the way a lot of the time. They are pests. They are nuisances. And to Conan, they are in so many ways. In the show, they are nuisances to him. And they are complications, but they're complications he can't shake. And in some instances, there are some things that 1 or 2 things that they will even say that will trigger something for Conan that will help him solve a case. So in some ways they are useful, but in a lot of ways they are there as the nuisance for him and kind of a barrier into things sometimes that he can't do because they're there. So they're obviously present, and those are the notable characters that we really see in episode 1 show up. So really, in explaining a lot of these characters, I've explained a lot about episode 1, but before I do a review on episode 1 through 5, I really wanted to also reiterate, these characters that come along, really, season one is built around just these characters for the most part. As far as my review for episode one, we'll get right into it. Honestly, we start off the episode, you have the music going, and you see this figure moving in the darkness, on a building, and just sliding across, a really steep, or a pier basically, and just constantly stepping and stepping, and then just basically ropes his way over to a balcony, and then shutters open and a guy steps back and gets shot. What a way to open the show, because you have no idea really what's happening in that moment. And the music's going, and people start, coming in, and he's seeing what was going on, and they're just looking down at the dead man on the floor. And then, obviously, it flashes to Inspector McGuire talking, and then all of a sudden we see Jimmy come in and solve the case rather quickly. And from there, you see him really full of himself at this point. Jimmy Kudo's really full of himself. I mean, his head is about to explode with how good he feels. And he is just, talking about fan mail, talking about how he's an ace detective, how he wants to constantly spread the word that he's a great detective, that he's an ace detective is what he said, actually. And, just something, just so cocky. And this is something I think that also you see in the episode infuriates Rachel to no end, just infuriates her to no end, that he is this cocky. And Richard, her father, obviously, like we've talked about earlier, just is so jealous of this guy. He can't get over how successful Jimmy is. And he wishes he had that success. He really does. And you can tell in the episode that there's a lot of resentment towards this cocky kid with a lucky streak. And that's what he says about him, that he's a cocky kid with a lucky streak. And, it's really, it's interesting how those roles sort of reverse as time goes on, obviously, with the help of Conan. And, who obviously is just Jimmy, shrunk by the drug. And, that proceeds to Jimmy and Rachel going on a date at an amusement park, and a murder happens to occur while they are on a roller coaster. And that is also where we first see gin and vodka show up. And, Jimmy very quickly solves this murder. And from there, has a lot of suspicions towards gin and vodka. He suspects that they are pretty bad guys. And you can tell something is going to happen with these characters, but you don't realize till the end of the episode where, they knock him out and they give him this drug, just how evil these people are. The fact that there was a lot of blackmail in the episode with them blackmailing an individual, a lot of money was involved, and, Jimmy was getting in the middle of it, so they tried to kill him and ended up, giving him a poison that just shrunk him instead. Overall in this episode, I'd have to say it was a very solid episode because it definitely tells you right away where the story's going. It really drags you in because you want to see if this guy can find these people that shrunk him. I mean, it's really the draw. Can he find the people that shrunk him? And can he somehow get his body back? You're cheering for him to be able to do that. And, I noticed watching in the episode, it's very sad because he's having to deceive the one person he really, really cares about. And you don't really see until a little bit later on that he really does care about Rachel and cares about her feelings. And honestly, it hurts him as a person, and it really makes you feel for that character. Moving on to the second episode, the second episode really picks up right where the first one leaves off. He is just now getting to, kind of see what Rachel really feels about him, because Rachel is confiding in Conan without really knowing that this is Jimmy Kudo, the person that she really cares about. And Conan finds out how much she really does care for him. And it does hurt him inside. And, all of a sudden, We've got episode 2 starting up. Richard's going crazy because somebody's finally called him to try to solve a case. And this episode is another one where it's a continuation of the first one, and you're hoping that this is a lead. And Conan also hopes this is a lead to find these men that shrunk him. So he is following, literally, in the first season, it seems like every episode could be a new lead. He is just following every single case as if it could be the case that leads to the Black Organization. And this one is no different in episode 2. Obviously, for people who have seen it, it turns out that it is a completely set up crime. The girl that was kidnapped in the episode was actually faked her own kidnapping with the help of the housekeeper or the butler, and then was kidnapped again by a really bad guy. And you think that the really bad guy at first might be the gin and vodka characters, or as Conan likes to refer to them, the Men in Black. So that is a lead that is followed up. Honestly, in the episode, it transpires that it's not them. And Conan, is on the ropes. Conan is able to track down the guy that's kidnapped this girl. But, he's finding that in his body there are so many limitations to what he can do. He's not as strong anymore. He can't fight the people that once he catches them. He's finding that this is going to be really difficult. And then Rachel comes to his aid. Overall in this episode, episode 2 we're talking about now, I'd have to say I was a little let down just because I was hoping there would be, and at the time I was hoping there would be an immediate lead for Conan to maybe strike back at this organization faster. Obviously, that's not the way it transpires, but as a viewer, you hope that this is a way for him to strike back. And in this case, it really wasn't, and it really started a story for him of every case that comes to him in the back of his mind. You feel it as a viewer that this could be something for him that leads to trying to find this organization. And by the time episode 3 hits, Conan is already, up to his neck in this. I mean, he is trying to hunt these people. Episode 3 really, you start to see the story kind of come together even more. You see a pop star show up at Richard Moore's doorstep, and this pop star happens to be somebody that he, is absolutely infatuated with. Would love to go on a dream date with this girl. Her name is Yoko Okino, and she's a pop, teen sensation, so to speak. And Richard Moore absolutely adores this girl, has posters of her up on his wall, and just the minute she shows up, he goes nuts and tries to look like Mr. Prince Charming. And at this point, it seems like Richard Moore really has the spotlight, and Conan and Rachel are really just, watching him like, oh, brother. This is something. So they're actually there because Yoko Okino, I believe, if memory serves me right, she is being stalked and wants help from Detective Moore on, having some help with this. So they go back to her apartment. Lo and behold, somebody's dead in her apartment. She's got somebody that's dead, and it turns out as the episode develops, it's a college boyfriend or high school boyfriend, and this was somebody she knew. And this obviously, if this gets out, this is a big publicity, scandal, and it could look very bad for her. And so in the episode, one of her rivals proceeds to show up. And, this is one of the episodes where things progressed at a very slow pace, I felt. I felt like things were progressing at a slow pace. And sometimes when you have episodes that aren't two-part episodes, if you're not developing that story fast enough, it will tend to stall. And then you'll try to cram everything at the very end. And sometimes that does happen with some of these. In this case, it was kind of that way, where they had a lot of time where they were just sitting around talking, and then at the very end, they kind of had to build this thing up. And overall, in the episode, not a whole lot was introduced except for the fact that Richard was knocked out for the first time. That was a completely new thing. I mean, that was the first time Richard was ever knocked out to help solve a case, and then Conan obviously has to use his voice changer to mimic Richard's voice and try to solve a case. The first of its kind. It's also the first case where a couple of the junior detectives from the Junior Detective League are joining Conan in his adventure, and not really playing a major role. They're just there. So this episode, honestly, I liked it, but I could see how some people would want to pass on it just because of the slow developing. But if you start watching the show, I mean, you've got to go through and watch it all the way through. You want to skip over anything. But if you just have to absolutely skip over it, I could completely understand on that. Then we go to episode 4 in this whole thing. I believe, yes, Fish Marks the Spot. And this episode really does heavily involve on the Junior Detective League, partnering with Conan. They're trying to solve a puzzle of some sort in this episode, and they're going through and they're trying to help each other out by solving this. And in the episode, they end up getting into a lot of trouble. I mean, it was an episode where you think something bad could happen to these kids, just because again. Conan's still getting used to, himself being a kid, and then these other kids, they haven't been wrapped up in anything really serious yet until this episode where they really are confronted with some dangerous guys. Traditional case closed style. Conan, pulls a stunt, saves the day. Not a whole lot going on in this episode, though. Episode 3 had a little more going on in it, though, than episode 4. This was a case that you could easily skip over and not feel bad about. It was a cutesy episode, not one that I was really a huge fan of. I probably only rewatched this once, which is why it's still a little cloudy on me. I know the episode and I know the premise, but as far as an episode that's memorable, not so much. As far as that, one of the weaker episodes of the 5 that we're going to talk about today, and now we're going to move on to a really strong one. Obviously, the last episode we'll cover here, for this podcast, episode 5 of the show. Very controversial, honestly, because in the manga, episode 5 was supposed to involve the Black Organization. I believe in the manga version, gin and vodka were actually present in the manga version of this particular episode. And in this episode, obviously, the episode title is The Time Bomb Express. This case starts out with a lot of drama because they are, you have Richard, you have Conan, you have Rachel on a train, going to God knows where, on a train. And there are these 2 men in black that are walking around. And Conan, from the back, these guys they look just like gin and vodka from the back. And it isn't until later Conan gets closer and closer, and this is where it gets kind of controversial, because in the manga version, it's them. In the anime version, it's not them. It turns out to be 2 men that are completely unrelated to gin and vodka. Granted, on this particular case, they were bad guys, though. On this particular, case, they played a role that was sinister in a lot of ways. They were one of the main, protagonists in the episode, and this one had a lot of drama to it. This one was one of the better episodes. Even though gin and vodka were not in this and there was some controversy there, this was one of the better episodes of season 1 altogether. You're constantly wondering how Conan is going to break out of the situation he's put in with a bomb being on the train. And, the anticipation is really, ramped up at this point. And, is he going to tell Rachel who he is? That was the big catch in the episode, because he's very, very close to telling Rachel who he is so that he can try to save her life. And, even though it might endanger a lot of the people around him, he's thinking, we might not live through this anyway. I've got to tell her. And, maybe she can save us if she knows the truth. So there's a lot of drama in this episode, and a lot of things unfold. And, it's another one of those moments where you see Conan's real concern and how much he really cares for Rachel in this. He doesn't end up having to confess who he is, which is good because, you have a show that is so long, knowing that early on, I think would really hurt the show for a long run. So the fact that he doesn't confess is a big, is kind of a big shock. At the same time, it was one of those things where he couldn't really. So, of course, this particular episode had a lot of drama to it. Of course, the controversy of why wasn't gin and vodka in there, and why is it these other two randoms that look just like them. Overall, this episode is fantastic. You really should watch this episode. If you're going to watch season 1, if you want to skip over episode 4, then go right to episode 5. Fantastic episode, something you really don't want to pass up, and something I highly recommend. So that overall is our take on the first 5 episodes for Case Closed. On our next episode, we are going to be reviewing episodes 6 through 10. Do always keep in mind these are spoiler reviews. So, if you have not seen the show, obviously, and you've somehow sat through this whole video, don't watch the next episode if you want anything spoiled. These are for people, for the most part, that, want to have a discussion about these episodes and in the process we're reviewing them. So I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of this series, and I hope to see you in the second episode of Case Closed Review. Take care, everybody.